All right, welcome. Welcome to this afternoon session on how this stuff is cool, but how can I get my company to do it? Or as I like to call it, businessing the S out of transformative development. My name is Mark Heckler. I am a principal technologist and developer advocate with Pivotal Software, Inc. Pivotal are the makers of Spring Boot, the Spring Framework, Redis, Greenplum, RabbitMQ, Cloud Foundry, a huge contributor to Apache Tomcat, and much, much more. We like to call it a tiny little startup in Silicon Valley. I blog less frequently than I would like, actually, at my personal domain, thehecklers.org. I tweet all the time at mkheck. Is everyone here on Twitter? Okay, Twitter's good. I'm also a member of the slightly older and more established social network called Email. My email address is there as well. Is everyone on email? Okay, good. I was going to worry if people didn't respond to that one. It is Devoxx. But anyway, I have a lot of ground to cover here today. Very excited to bring this talk, actually. I have been wanting to do this talk for a long, long time. And finally, just this year, I've kind of started, I put everything together and started throwing it out there. And I always tell people that I either love it or hate it because this is off the beaten path. But I've gotten good response, and it was something I was excited to do. So on we go. If I miss something that you wanted to talk about, again, we only have 50 minutes. If I glibly pass over something that you felt maybe needed a little more clarification, please do ping me. That's why I list my email address. That's why I list my Twitter account. Please follow, please email, whatever. Happy to discuss this at length offline. And usually that's where the best conversations happen because, again, 50 minutes. So, who am I? Well, I'm the author of several blogs and blog posts. I've co-authored one book and have another one in the pipeline. I've contributed to many others. I love to read, I love to write, I love to share information because I always feel like if we all share information, we all get smarter faster. That seems like a net positive to me. I've spoken around the world on various development-centered and less development-centered topics. Thanks for inviting me here, by the way. Those of you who were in my session yesterday know that yesterday was my wedding anniversary. So I left my wife in the U.S. and came here to spend the week with you. So thank you very much for having me. I hope my wife still does pick me up at the airport when I get back home. I'm cautiously optimistic. Anyway, first and foremost, so I'm a developer. I've worked for small and large companies. I worked for Oracle for a stretch of years. I now hang my virtual hat at Pivotal. I use what works. I try to find gaps where it doesn't and fill those, just like everyone else. Love open source. That's where my heart is. That's where I think the future of development is. And I'm always looking for a better way to deploy real software to production. And this is something that I don't talk about a lot, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it just doesn't come up. I'm an MBA. I have a Master's of Business Administration. Business and engineering are not disciplines that are entirely at odds with each other. I wasn't a big fan of my marketing and management studies, but statistics, economics, finance, I love those. And if you're an analytical type of person, I think you probably would as well. So, today I will be presenting in English for your safety. Listening to me try to speak Polish is sort of like listening to Vogons recite poetry. I don't want to do that to you, so English it is. And the goal for today, as with my other talk actually, is to stay as close to a purely fact-based discussion as possible. I will be using example numbers, so they don't necessarily apply to every situation. In fact, I can guarantee they won't apply to every situation. There is no one-size-fits-all. But I use the numbers to demonstrate the concepts and the calculations and things of that nature. Please don't take them wholesale and apply them to anything without employing thought and analysis of your own. That's my disclaimer. Actually, that's the start of my disclaimers, I guess. First is I'm human, so I will probably say things you might disagree with. That's fine. I have pretty good reasons for what I'm saying. I have opinions. Maybe my opinions aren't right. Feel free to throw out something to correct me or suggest or ask if I really do firmly believe that and why. Again, happy to discuss this all at length. When you do financial analysis, you are making measurements. Measurements require assumptions. Those should be clearly stated and quantified. The difficulty that we deal with is we're taking a lot of times very qualitative measures, qualitative concepts, and trying to make them quantitative. We're trying to assess in some way the numerical impact of said topic at that point in time. That's not an exact science. It is science, but it's not exact. So we have to clearly state our assumptions up front, expose those to everyone else so that they can be challenged, and that they can be refined so that they can be better assumptions and produce better outcomes. I always recommend you estimate benefits associated with a particular approach or tool or what have you conservatively, and estimate your costs very liberally. This builds in a little bit of buffer, so if things don't go ideally, and things never go ideally, you don't suddenly appear to be a fraud. I always tell people if you estimate your benefits low and your costs high, if you hit those targets, that's great. If you miss those targets, you still have a chance to refine and carry on with the next phase. If you do it the other way around and you wildly miss, have massive cost overruns and don't come in with the benefits anywhere near what you claimed, you may not get a second chance. So, again, be careful. The numbers you see are examples, again. These don't apply universally to anything. Nothing applies universally to anything, so don't check your brain at the door. Use these things and employ them in your circumstances with the facts you have at hand for your situation. And again, adjust sensibly. So, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Yeah, I'm hearing people finish the quote. Excellent, excellent. This is not something to be thrown around lightly. Again, your reputation is important to you, and you don't want to go in and glibly throw out crazy numbers that then get approved, and then you're on the hook and things don't turn out well, and you have to hang your head in shame and leave. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. So, typically in talks, by the way, this is the sum total of all knowledge in the world, right here. So if you get these 2 books, you'll know everything. So we're done. Any questions? Just kidding. These are the kind of things that we generally talk about in these sessions, but today we're going to switch over a little bit more to this mode. We still keep our feet in the tech stack, but we're going to be expanding upon that in terms that perhaps your managers or your financial people in your company can understand. So what's really on the agenda, right? We'll be discussing a concept called payback or payback period. That's a financial construct. I'll be explaining that, showing examples of that as well. Discussing net present value, or NPV for short, and how it's in many ways a better measurement of value of an investment. And investment, I mean adoption of a technology in this case. Quantification. How do we, again, apply some kind of numerical analysis to very difficult to quantify concepts, and basing that upon solid, well-reasoned, calculated assumptions? We want to nail those down to the absolute utmost extent that we can. There are several steps to get there, but it's not really that hard, so don't panic. Don't panic, right? Okay, in a nutshell, payback, the formula for payback is the cost of the project, the overall cost, divided by the annual cash inflow or savings. This can be cost avoidance as well, depending on your whether it's profit or non-profit or what have you. And that results in the payback period. So let's take a look at an example. If you have a project that you can adopt, and it costs you, and I'll use dollars, but I mean whether you're using zloty or euros, the concept is exactly the same. I just know that if I try to mentally switch to another currency, halfway through I'll switch back. So if you have a project which will have $500,000 in total costs, and it brings in $200,000 a year in new income, or again, cost avoidances, that results in a payback period of 2.5 years. It's a very simple calculation. So let's take a look at some of the things that go into that. A shorter payback period, no surprise here, is generally better. It's more liquid. Your money, your investments are freed up sooner so that your company can then make other investments. That said, also, a longer payback means more uncertainty and greater risk because market conditions change. Interest rates change, the competitive landscape changes. So the world in 3 years looks a lot different than the world of today, just like the world of today looks a lot different from 3 years ago. Generally, for that reason, a payback period of 3 years or less is preferred. Again, nothing really surprising there. And usually, generally speaking, a payback period of under a year is considered an essential project. That's really the holy grail. That's what you want to go for. So, drawbacks to the concept of payback. Well, there's no consideration of total value, right? Because if you make your money back in 2 years, but it continues to produce additional revenue for 10 years, 20 years, payback doesn't take that into account at all. You're only concerned with how quickly am I going to get my investment back. As an example, let's look at a couple different projects, and you'll, I think, get a pretty clear idea of what I mean. If you have a project which has a 3-year payback, you get your investment back in 3 years, but it throws off no further revenue after year 5, and let's consider it has a lifetime value of $250,000. So that's its total lifetime value. If you have another project you're evaluating, and you can only choose one. Again, money is a fixed resource, so there's only so much that our company can produce or obtain. If you have a competing project which offers a 5-year payback, so it takes longer to get your money back out of it, but it has ongoing value and a lifetime value of $1 million. Which one would you choose? And there's no right answer to this, really. I mean, it depends on a lot of constraints within your company. But that is part of the conundrum of payback. It's rather incomplete measure. There's no consideration also of the time value of money, because a dollar or a unit of currency, a zloty, euro, whatever, is worth a certain amount today. If someone were to hand you $1 today or hand you $1 10 years from now, which is worth more? Obviously the dollar today, because it has to be discounted. I'll get into that concept a little bit more as we go along. But there's no consideration of the time value of money, the value in today's constant currency. So payback is a good measure, but it's an incomplete measure. There is another measure called internal rate of return. You see that used sometimes. I generally avoid that one just because it uses one single discount rate to evaluate every investment. NPV is very flexible, as you'll see here pretty shortly, and allows you to run a lot of different calculations and customize it extensively. That's, to me, the best measurement, the best total picture. So the formula for NPV is the net period cash flow, the summary, I should say, of net period cash flows divided by 1 plus r to the t power, where r is the rate of return for that period, and t is the number of time periods. You summarize those, and you get the net present value of the entire project. So just to do an example to kind of clarify it, I have a couple of examples of this that I do a little differently, and that kind of shows, I think, quite well the power of net present value. If you have a project which produces, like our second project mentioned a few minutes ago, produces $1 million in lifetime value over the course of 5 years. And with NPV, you can set your time period to be anything. If you're, and I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but if things change on a yearly basis, let's say your cost of borrowing, the cost of acquiring capital, if it changes on a yearly basis, you'll typically want to evaluate that and use a time period of 1 year. But what if it changes on a semi-annual basis or a quarterly basis? And let's just go crazy. Maybe it changes, your cost of borrowing changes on a weekly or daily basis. I suppose it could happen. Probably not, but I suppose it could. You can adjust this to use whatever time period you want in here. You just have a larger summary, right? But let's just say for this example, we have $1 million in new revenue that we realize over 5 years, and our cost of borrowing or cost of capital is 5%. So $1 million divided by 1.05 to the 5th power results in $783,526 net present value in today's dollars, in today's constant currency. The second example actually shows some of the flexibility that this formula offers, because let's say you realize revenue unevenly. In year one, maybe you have a ramp-up period. In year one, you realize $100,000 of additional revenue. Year two, maybe $200,000. Year three, $400,000. So in total, we're looking at $700,000 in new revenue. Let's also say during that same time period that your cost of borrowing, your cost of capital goes down. So for year one, you may be able to borrow at a 5% rate. Year two, 4%. Year three, 3%. This shows you that you can deal with uneven revenue flows as well as uneven costs with NPV, and it handles it just fine. So again, you run through the numbers, you perform the calculations, and you come out, instead of the $700,000, in today's dollars, this investment will return you $646,206. So some of the inputs and associated challenges. Well, first, again, you're quantifying qualitative measures. That is not easy. It can break your head after a point. And that's why it's so critical to document assumptions well so that you can hammer those out and eliminate as much ambiguity and as much squishiness, if you will, as possible. You need to look at a lot of different things, and the more inputs that you can define and quantify, the more accurate your calculations can be. Obviously, there are limits, and I kind of address that here shortly as well. But you need to look at some things like, how would this particular initiative affect your organizations or your groups or your teams' work? How would it impact your technical stack? How would it contribute to your company's recruitment or retention? And this is something that I don't really address as much in my example calculations, but it's something that kind of needs to be factored in, because I think all of us would much rather work on interesting work with interesting technologies. That makes recruitment easier, it makes retention easier, and that's an intangible, but it should be quantifiable with sufficient rigor, right? At least to some degree. How also would it affect the business? And I get into some examples of that as well. So, pros and cons. What are the ups and downs of doing this to begin with? Well, first of all, any critical analysis yields a better understanding of inputs and impacts. So even from a purely technical perspective, you're going to understand a lot more of what is involved with a particular initiative. That is nothing but a good thing. It can also provide more objective and compelling justification for the initiative. And I always hesitate to say that, because your goal is not to justify the initiative. Your goal is to analyze the initiative. But when you analyze it objectively, it helps you justify it if the numbers support it. Some of the cons. Well, to put it mildly, this can be very time-consuming. There is no automatic conversion between qualitative and quantitative measures, and there are a lot of qualitative measures. So this gets into something that you could literally be open-ended with. You could create a position and work the rest of your life trying to quantify all of these squishy measures and never get anything done. And that just can't happen. You know, no progress means no company, no job. So, some of the caveats. Well, again, time is a constraint. You can't analyze everything. The world does keep moving. You know, if you don't move out on this, someone else will, and it all becomes moot anyway. So I always say gather enough data, and enough being, again, rather subjective, but you again, try to apply sufficient rigor and then get enough data to make a decent decision with and move on. Some of the assumptions, well, be forewarned that assumptions form the basis of all of your conclusions, and bad assumptions can lead to inaccurate conclusions. Good assumptions can also lead to inaccurate conclusions if they're not properly analyzed and weighted and what have you. The key to a solid analysis is to make supportable assumptions and document them meticulously so that they can be discussed, refined, and reconsidered. So that if there are problems with your assumptions, somebody hopefully will catch that and adjust those or correct you on them. And that's good because by the time you get a solid set of assumptions, everybody should be at this stage. Everybody should be in agreement. So let's run through it. Suit is optional. I did want to tell you I dressed specifically for this occasion. I know my wardrobe may look like it's randomly generated. It's not. I wanted to dress in a way that bespeaks power and wealth. So I'm wearing my Wayne Enterprises shirt today. Oh, come on. I did this for you guys. You know, to quote Dr. Sheldon Cooper, what's life without whimsy, right? So, today we're going to, and I've done this a couple or three different ways. I like this best. We're going to be considering microservices or migrating to a microservices architecture. Again, like every large transformative practice, this is kind of fraught with peril when you analyze it, but we'll break it down by the numbers and see what you think. So I'm not going to go too much into the specifics and mechanics of microservices, but I will kind of hit some of the high points, the claimed benefits, and what we're going to use to build our assumptions and our quantifications on. So let's see. First of all, typically return on investment, and you'll hear that sometimes thrown around, return on investment or ROI. ROI, when somebody says that, they typically mean something like internal rate of return, net present value. It's, again, what you're going to get back for investments that you pour into something. Typically, when we're looking at a microservice architecture, we're going to be building our ROI around accelerated realization of benefits. We're going to get stuff out of our investment faster. More so than the overall business transformation, although I do speak to that a little bit later as well. There are potential opportunities for that. But that's not kind of primary. So I mentioned that and move along. Reduced maintenance costs. Because again, and without going into all the whys, typically a microservices approach means that you're maintaining smaller chunks of things. When things break, they're easier to find and fix, etc. We also will be considering that there would be potential for increased business opportunities through new APIs. Again, that kind of falls under the potential business opportunities and transformation. I address that as well to some degree. Microservices allow you to selectively scale any high-demand microservices, which reduces costs. You don't scale the entire monolith. You don't duplicate everything. So every time you have to expand and scale, you double your footprint. You can selectively scale and keep your costs down while increasing your capabilities. We do recognize, with this exercise, of course, that any investment requires upskilling, coaching, mentoring. Please do make sure you factor in new costs to your new initiative, because nothing is all upside, right? You want an accurate picture, and part of that includes how much it's going to take to get what you want to happen. So some expectations. Well, again, with microservices, we're talking small batch sizes and small teams. These are bounded contexts. Each microservice has an API. So it provides and forms a contract with other microservices for interactions. It limits exposure. It provides you a lot of other insulative capabilities or properties, we'll just say. More functionality can be delivered to market or internal end users faster. Building the right product, because you have a tight development loop, so you have a tight feedback loop. I typically say, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but typically with a microservices approach, you hit the target better and faster. So again, I have another whole talk on this. I don't want to get into the mechanics of that as much as I do the numbers. So we'll move along with this. Improved quality, because again, you have the opportunity to make smaller mods and push them out faster versus major overhauls, which have a much longer runway. Improved end user satisfaction. Again, all of these things are documented in various studies. Small frequent releases expose and help resolve process issues in the small. And when releases are tiny, well-planned, and choreographed events, they can happen at will. Again, my purpose is not to sell you on microservices. I'm using this as an example. Compared with monoliths. Here's where we get into the assumptions, folks. This is where the rubber really meets the road. This is where you build your assumptions and your analysis. With a monolithic application, you have an average cadence of releases of about 1 per year. I like to ask this, I hope I can see people. Who here has a release cycle of one or more applications in your company that's 12 months or more? Okay. Well, we've got a few honest people in the room, or else you guys are all working for startups, one or the other. Maybe that's it. Anyone here work for financial institutions? Brokers, banks, so on and so forth? Yeah. I always pick on them, not because they're necessarily that unique, but they're always a great example of this. They typically have longer release cycles because they have more security regulations and things that they have to deal with, as well as just security team who's very uptight about compromises and crazy stuff like that. So I work a lot with a company who has a 12 to 18 month release cycle. For those of you who work, I guess let me ask this: 6 to 12 months, typically? Okay, a few. 3 to 6? 1 to 3? Under 1 month? Under 1 week? Okay, excellent. Okay, that's cool. With a monolithic application, I use 1 year as the average release cycle. There are some which go 18 months, which seems crazy, but it happens. We use a year because it's easy to manage. Typically with a year release cadence, you're looking at 10 months of development before some kind of code freeze, which then results in about a month of integration testing and bug fixes, and then maybe a month of user acceptance tests, which of course results in several confirmations, several course corrections, and several logging of, quote, new requirements, which in many cases are old requirements that weren't properly fulfilled. So again, I'm being optimistic here on behalf of monoliths everywhere. Compared to microservices. Microservices have a little different release cadence. I'm going to use this for my example, sort of. The average cadence of microservice releases are 7,448 per day. And everybody always gasps and says, "Where'd you get the number?" It's right down here, actually. Amazon published some figures in 2011 and said that every 11.6 seconds they release another new or updated microservice. Okay, that's 2011. It's improved a little since then. If your company, now again, everybody's not Amazon, right? But if your company is only 1/1000th as effective as Amazon was 5 years ago, today, that's still over 7 releases a day, or over 2,500 releases a year, compared with 1 for your monolith. So it's a little bit different ballgame. We're going to, again, I like to estimate benefits low. So we'll assume that you can muster the Herculean task of creating 14 new microservices in your first year, which is, I know, kind of crazy. But all kidding aside, cultural and organizational changes will result in fewer than you might imagine when you begin this type of journey. But seriously, this really is a ridiculously low number, but it's a starting point. So with that in mind, if by the end of year 1 you've released 14 new microservices and you release at a pace of 7 a day, that means that every other day you're releasing an update, or could potentially release an update to a microservice, right? To a particular microservice. So let's go with that. I think we can surely all agree that that's well within the realm of possibility. So let me ask you this: how much more functionality can be delivered more quickly or more accurately, or both? If you could approach 0 with missed requirements, missed opportunities, missed expectations, how much is that worth? If any of you are working on that 12-month release cycle and you have a user come to you and say, "Hey, we really need this bit of functionality because it's either an opportunity in the market or maybe a competitor has just implemented this. We need to match that so we don't lose ground." What are you going to tell them? If you have to tell them it could be a year or 2 years, depending on where you are in that release cycle, that's not great. If you tell them that you could probably implement that within 3 to 4 weeks, how does that sound? What does that open up for you? And again, if users can have needed functionality months or years sooner, what's that worth to your company as a whole? And I think the answer is quite a lot, actually. So Picture a few instances of volatile functionality within your company, things your end users are demanding. If you're in the financial field, maybe what your brokers or agents or bank locations are asking for. If you're in the auto industry, maybe customers or dealers have requested certain features. It can be either systems driven or systems supported. If we focus on producing key abilities, such as the 14 microservices we previously mentioned, because that's an excellent toehold, that's an excellent start, we can expect to be able to define interfaces. In most cases, they'll be REST APIs in our monolith so that we can interoperate with our monolith. We can exchange information with the existing large system that's kind of sitting out there already. For our figures, we assume 6 months to get these new APIs live in our monolith so that we can interact with it. Why 6 months? Well, again, if we're talking about a monolith having a 12-month release cycle for our example, we don't know where we'll fall within that. Maybe we'll catch the beginning, maybe we'll catch the tail end. But for our numbers, we have to come up with something. So we average it. We say 6 months on average. The average business size that I'm using is 500 million in annual revenue. That's probably a low estimate, but this is the median mid-sized US business. And in many projects like this, and the preponderance of projects like this, of this significant scope, they typically are tackled by mid or large-sized businesses. So even that's probably a little bit of a low estimate. I'm going to apportion the revenue or new revenue to each microservice, and that's kind of maybe going a little overboard. There's no real reason you'd have to divide it by 14 and all of this, but it makes the numbers pretty clear on the screen, so I do that. But we're going to estimate the impact of these highly volatile, high-demand projects per microservice, and we'll say that it results in about $1 million in new revenue per microservice. Again, just for argument's sake. So, kind of what do we have here? Well, we're going to need some upskilling. So Pivotal has a thing called Pivotal Labs. There are numerous consultancies that transfer knowledge, that bring you up to speed on new technologies and new initiatives. So you're going to need something like that for your teams that are now going to be the vanguard of your microservices initiative. Excuse me. There will be some ramp up, so that is a cost you can factor in as well. I've left that out because it's typically offset by avoidance of contextualization issues. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you turn a developer loose on implementing a new bit of technology within a monolithic application, a large, all-encompassing, many-tentacled monolithic application, there are a lot of contextualization drags on their efforts. There's a lot of time that goes into researching potential effects, ripple effects, and dealing with those when they come up. With microservices, again, you're bound by your API contracts. Your risk is somewhat lower because, again, everything that you're dealing with your monolith has been defined, the capabilities via that new API that you've implemented. So, again, you have additional costs, you have additional benefits. I've left those out just for simplicity, but again, you do want to, if they're sufficient and quantifiable enough, you'll want to include those. I've also left out other things that may smooth or speed the path, such as cloud provisioning. Does that help you? Sure. CI/CD tools, et cetera, well, then that also adds some costs and time and training and things like that. So, again, depends on how crazy you want to go with this. You can add a lot more costs and benefits to it. I've mentioned those, but I omit them from the calculations. You will have some additional platform costs. Again, with every bit of new functionality, you're going to have to either extend your systems that you have, or you're going to need to do some kind of a platform acquisition, so like cloud operational expenses, or for existing infrastructure, if you add on, you'll have additional capital expenses and operational expenses as well. I'm factoring in a couple of million. Now, for a small initial deployment of 14 microservices, that's way excessive. But again, estimate benefits high, costs high, benefits low. Yeah, don't get that turned around. It's like the stock market. You never want to buy high, sell low. And of course, we're not going to take credit for all of the new functionality that if we didn't embark upon this initiative, that we could still implement within our monolithic application. Again, the pace is typically slower, so we don't think we can implement all 14 million of new functionality, but maybe 5, it just takes time. We're not going to take credit for implementation that you would have done anyway in some other manner. So, as a summary, here's kind of what we have in totals. New revenues for year one, we project to be at 14 million. We have expenses, which total somewhere around 8 million, which leaves us a year one net gain of $6 million. So that doesn't look too bad, right? Let's plug it into our formulas and see what we get. We're going to take the cost of the project, divide by our annual cash inflow to come up with our payback and find out what the numbers show. Our total cost of project, we projected at 8 million. We have projected our cash inflows of 14 million. So our payback period, when you divide those, comes out to 6.86 months. Right? Yeah, it seems like an easy sell. But not so fast. Again, remember, payback is a good measure, but it's incomplete, right? So let's, again, review the numbers. Actually, you know what? I just skipped what I thought I was doing, but let's examine the whole project, the project as a whole, because net present value doesn't just look at one slice of it, it looks at the whole thing. So here are our totals for year one. Let's go ahead and examine our assumptions for subsequent years, because this is a 3-year run, right? So we're going to estimate that we can double our productivity over year one in year two. Again, we're going to add 28 whopping new microservices in year two. Who here is doing some microservices pilots or projects? Okay. Can you tell me if that's realistic or an absolutely ridiculously low number after 2 years? Yeah. It's crazy, yeah. But we're just going to run with this again because I like to keep things manageable. So we're going to say that from our 14 new microservices in year one, we're going to add 28 more in year two. Which leads us to have a total by end of year two of 42. 42, right? 42? Oh, come on, guys. No Hitchhiker's Guide fans? All right, well, anyway. Sigh. All right, we're going to estimate that we'll have a slightly reduced impact. This may be overly pessimistic. You can look at this one of two ways. You can either assume that you took the absolute best opportunities that first year and you've gone through all of them. What is more likely to happen, actually, is after your customers realize that you can crank out new functionality that more closely mirrors what they need, and you can do it in a short time frame, guess what? The requirements are going to come flowing in. The opportunities for increasing your company's revenue, decreasing your company's expenses, are going to start hitting you faster than they ever have. That's not a bad thing. But again, we'll assume that we're exhausting the best opportunities and reducing our potential impact, just again to be overly pessimistic about that. So let's assume that for those 28 microservices, we'll only have a per microservices upside of about $750,000 instead of that 1 million impact. So multiplication tells us 28 times 750,000 is about 21 million in new realized revenues, new to year two. We add that to the new revenues that have resulted from our year one efforts of 14 million, so we get a total by end of year two of 35 million in new revenue. We assume, again, I think quite generously, that we have a linear ability to expand our monolith, which again is probably crazy optimistic. But we'll assume that by end of year two, $10 million worth of new functionality could have been implemented and added to our monolith from where we started at the beginning of year one. So here are what our totals look like by end of year two. 35 million in new revenues, expenses. We're going to continue to upskill. We're going to continue to invest in our people because chances are you're going to expand your microservices teams, right? You're going to add on. And this is another neat thing, and I haven't really covered this, but it's a very real possibility, is microservice teams, you can expand in parallel. You can't just throw more people at a monolith and adding functionality into different areas of it and have it work out quite as well. That's why I'm rather generously assuming that we can continue the crazy pace of 5 million more in new functionality in the monolith if we were to do that as an option. But we're going to continue to invest in training new team members and adding to the skills of our existing team members in the microservices group, if you will. We're going to still say we have platform costs of a couple $1 million. Again, rather high, rather excessively high, considering we only have 42 microservices running in our environment. But again, estimate costs high. We're going to invest another $1 million in defining more interfaces for our monolith so that we can expand our microservices stable. And we're going to, again, assume that $5 more million in new functionality could have been implemented this year in the monolith for a total of 10. So that brings us to a year 2 net gain of 21 million. Let's take it out one more year. Whoops, wrong button. And let's look at our year 3 assumptions. Again, we double. And again, this is fairly small pace, fairly slow pace, because we're continuing to add people and add initiatives. And, again, this is pretty leisurely pace. But it works well and again, keeps us from assuming we're inflating anything. So we have 42 new microservices at the end of year 2. We're going to add 56 more, because 2 times 28 from year 2 is 56, which gives us a total of 98 new microservices by the end of year 3. Again, we're going to be really horrible pessimists and assume that there'll be further reduced impact. Each of our new microservices really only adds about 500,000 if you break out your new revenue by unit. So 56 new microservices times 500,000 equals 28 million. We add that to our continuing revenue from years 1 and 2 of 35 million. So that leads for year 3, 63 million in new revenue. Again, we assume a linear ability to expand the monolith, which again is excessively optimistic, but we'll give it credit for doing so. So by end of year 3, here's kind of what our totals look like. New revenues for year 3, 63 million. Additional costs of upskilling, because we're going to continue to invest in our people and our teams. We're going to, again, increase our platform costs rather dramatically, right? And again, this is probably way high. Better to do that. 6 million interfaces. Again, we're going to be defining more interfaces in our monolith for an additional $1 million. If we implemented this same, or as much of this same functionality in our monolith, we would have invested 15, or be able to realize 15 million of revenue via another route. So we subtract that out, and we come out with a year 3 net gain of 40 million. So let's plug this into our calculation, right? Year 1, and of course you see that we have uneven distribution of revenue. Year 1, 6 million, year 2, 21, year 3, 40. We're going to assume a constant cost of capital of 5%, adjust as situation demands. So over the course of 3 years, our net present value for the revenue we bring in, the profit, if you will, is $61,086,277. Right? Better example, better, more complete measurement than Payback. Results are the same, but this, again, is a much more exhaustive analysis of the benefits and costs associated with the project. So, to go through and maybe take a quick look at some of the key factors here. Remember, you're quantifying qualitative measures. That is not easy. It is not always precise. It is frustrating for a precise mind to address that there are concepts which are very difficult to assign a number to, but that should not stop you from trying. You need to factor in how this initiative would affect your organization's groups or teams' work. You need to assess how it would impact your technical stack, how it would contribute to recruitment or retention, which we kind of mentioned, but really didn't get into numbers here. That varies by organization and even within a vertical, by the way. As you probably already know, if you've tried to recruit or keep people and you found it, maybe if you switched verticals, you've seen how much easier or more difficult that is depending on your market. And how it would affect the business as a whole. The reason I say that how it would affect the business as a whole, I always think about Amazon. 10 years ago, Amazon was a bookseller, right? And Bezos came out with a statement that every bit of functionality would be provided via a well-defined service and exposed via interfaces to other services. So last year was the first year that Amazon made more money from Amazon Web Services than all of their sales of goods combined. So when you're talking about how it would affect the business, when you look at a particular initiative, it can dramatically transform your business to effectively being something different than what it is today. That's not a bad thing. But this is something else you need to try to some degree, to the extent possible, to factor into your calculations. You probably don't want to go into your finance people and tell them, hey, I've got an idea how we can reinvent our business, but realize that when you do start taking on initiatives, things will change. And the more you account for that, the more you at least address it and give a nod to it, the more complete your calculations will be. So in summary, a critical analysis yields better understanding of inputs and impacts, and it can provide more objective and compelling justification for the initiative. However, be honest. Document and communicate your assumptions clearly, and be open to course corrections, because I find that when you clearly state your assumptions, ironically, you get a lot less pushback, because people focus on your assumptions. They don't focus on the numbers at the end until they've established that these assumptions are solid or not. And if they're not, they're focused exactly where you want them to be, where they can tell you where your assumptions are wrong. And if they're wrong, you want to know that as well, because then you get, garbage in, garbage out. But if you have good inputs, you have better outputs. So that by the time you get to discussing those end numbers, everyone should be doing a lot more of this and a lot less of this, right? This is not the enemy. So often we like to vilify and poke fun at our managers and our financial types. I always like to say they're your allies, because if they weren't keeping your company profitable, you wouldn't have a company. So even though it gets frustrating at times, the more you speak their language, the more you are on their side, the more they can be on your side. And that is a win-win, truly, for everyone. So that's it. We have actually a couple minutes, so the timing was almost perfect. Are there any questions? Yes? Sure. I'm not even sure this is on, to be honest with you. Do we have? Yes, we do.
All right. Everybody hear me? Okay. I work for a company called LJP Technologies, and we are under contract right now with the largest healthcare management provider in the U.S. They have a very large monolithic system built on .NET. It's really kind of ugly what it does.
That was the right response, by the way, whoever did that.
And we've been engaged on this project for the cost savings specifically. This thing is running on about 1,500 servers, has a massive SQL Server database, and just in licensing and support, they're spending about $3 million a year. So when we came in to convert this over to Java, Spring, a lot of that, it was a no-brainer for them to invest in about $500,000 in consulting fees with us to help them retool their .NET shop and basically bring them up to using microservices as like a total example of your presentation.
Oh, excellent.
So $500,000 with us, they probably have about $500,000 in staffing on their side of labor into this. We'll probably incur a couple $100,000. We're bringing in gigaspaces, so some licensing costs there. But obviously, maybe $1.5 million spend, $3 million in licensing that goes away in the first year. Really a no-brainer of them for them.
And again, quantifying all of that, we're in fact now officially out of time, but I'll throw this together really quickly. Quantifying all of that makes for a pretty easy sell, right? Objectively quantifying all of that. When you don't necessarily have a dog in the hunt, you present it objectively and clearly. It allows your financial people to, quote, make the right decision, right? All right, thanks. And I will shut this down, but I did want to say, let's keep the conversation going. Again, you'll probably think of things you want to ask or say or suggest that I should have covered differently or better, or please reach out to me, let me know. Always refining, right? Thanks for coming.